The question is, do pigs fly? That's what I was asked during a live call-in talk show that I hosted many, many years ago when I first got into television news. It was a public affairs show. We were talking about something scintillating, like watching paint dry at a city council meeting. And it was the old-fashioned phone that we had on the set where you would actually click on it. There was a line. You click on, hi, you're on the air. Hi, you're on the air. And somebody calls in and they say, there's just one thing I want to know. Yes, I say. And the caller says, do pigs fly? And in that moment, I thought, I love this business. It's live, it's unpredictable. You have to be at the top of your game every moment of the day. Take the job seriously. Do not take yourself too seriously. And in that split second, I thought, what's important here? Well, I've always thought that the facts were important. So, do pigs fly? I said to the caller. Not on this program. Click. In the 30-plus years that I was in television, the program has changed a lot. There used to be just 3 networks, and now there's thousands of channels to choose from. TV has survived the web and Twitter, Facebook, smartphones, apps, all the other distractions that were predicting the demise of television news. Hasn't happened yet. When there is a big story, people still turn to TV. Just look at all the stories out there now. Just look at climate change, Russia, North Korea, Brexit, the Mueller report. But the actual day-to-day viewership is down. According to Nielsen, which is the company that analyzes TV ratings, broadcast TV is losing its appeal for the coveted 18 to 49-year-old age group. In the last few years, ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox have lost more than 27% of their viewers. Show of hands. How many of you still watch a 5 p.m. news? 5:30, 6, 7, 11? Very few of you. And according to Fortune magazine, cable TV news viewers are dominated by folks over the age of 50. So for the over 50 crowd, cable TV news makes up more than 11.5% of their TV viewing, but it's only 2.5% for folks ages 18 to 35. A couple of years ago, I was asking the general manager of an ABC station if the viewers' habits had changed, because it used to be the 11 p.m. news, that was the coveted newscast. I thought now with cell phones and streaming video that a lot of folks might be watching other things at night. That general manager asked me, how do you think audiences first connect with our TV station? How do you think? Online? I said to him, probably watching the morning show. Because people seem to be putting a lot more effort into the morning show. He shook his head and he said, no, their first point of contact is Facebook. I have often said that Facebook is the new TV and Twitter is the new headline news. People don't want to wait until a certain show airs. They want to get the news when they want to get it, not when the network thinks they should be watching it. Or they want to watch the streaming movie on Netflix or Hulu or Amazon when they want to watch it. My son, who is 20, doesn't own a TV, yet he knows everything that's going on. How, I asked him. He looked at me incredulous and he said, duh, YouTube and Twitter. Think about that. That is a fundamental shift, and it does not bode well for traditional TV. Local television stations are now streaming their news stories on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, so their audiences can gobble up content when they want to watch it, not just at 4, 5, 6, 7, or 11 p.m. when the TV stations are formally serving it up on the air. And while news consumption has gotten a boost from the current political climate, cable TV watching as a whole is also on the decline. According to Nielsen, people spend about 142 hours a month watching live TV. That's roughly 5 hours less than it was 1 year ago. And while older audiences between the ages of 50 to 64 watch almost 193 hours of TV a month, that is more than twice the amount watched by those between the ages of 18 and 24. Those folks are watching their favorite streaming shows from their computer, or of course, from this, right? From their cell phone. How many of you watch live cable TV in the evening? Cable TV, anybody? How many of you watch streaming video in the evening? Binge watching your favorite Netflix show? How many of you are watching it on your phone? There we go. So the world is changing. And after 30 plus years in the business as an evening news anchor, my world was changing as well. I had spent most of those years as a single person working until midnight, anchoring the 4, 4:35, 6, and 11 p.m. news. And then pretty late in the game, at the ripe old age of 42, I got married and had a child. And those late nights were taking a toll on my family. Almost 10 years ago, 3 things happened. I was negotiating a new long-term contract with NBC, which would have kept me employed until our son was done with high school, and I would continue to be gone in the afternoons and the evenings. I would miss out on so much of his teenage years, the last years of him being at home. The second thing that happened was Montana. We used to go to Montana every summer. My husband is from Montana, and the 3 of us were together, relaxed, laughing, just hanging out on a weeknight at a lake near Glacier National Park. I wasn't rushing to finish dinner, to kiss our son goodnight, to rush back to the newsroom to get ready for the 11 p.m. news. Back then, I was driving 100 miles a day to and from work to anchor the afternoon and early evening shows, race home for dinner, and then race back to anchor the 11 o'clock news. The third thing that happened was the 2011 blackout. Everybody remember that? Largest power outage in California history. It lasted 11 hours. I was at NBC, couldn't get in touch with my family. My son's reaction, he was panicked. When there is a really big story, I am separated from my family. I have to go to work. 9/11, I had to go to work. The massive wildfires in San Diego of 2003 and 2007, when our home was threatened, I had to leave to go to work to cover the story. The culture of the business had also changed. When I got into television, it was the post-Watergate era. There were just 3 major news channels. There was no 24-hour cable news back then. War, the economy, politics, education made headlines back then. Journalism at that time felt more like a public calling, a public service. I was never paid for my opinion. I was paid to present the facts and let the audience form their own opinion. But today, television, the news seems less about the facts and more about opinion. So TV news has moved away from appealing to a mass audience to one that appears to be more niche marketing. And in most cases, you only watch what is in sync with your own opinion. But if you told me 10 years ago that I would be here today, having given up the profession that had defined my adult life, I would have said absolutely no way. After all, I was part of the #1 ranked news team in San Diego for almost 16 years. Why do you walk away when you're #1? Well, life is funny. It's filled with twists and turns and surprises along the way. The cultural change for me began 12 years ago. The cultural change started with the phrase, "Have a nice surgery." The last words my 9-year-old son said to his grandpa, my dad, in December of 2008. Our family had gathered at a local Italian restaurant for one last meal before Dad's open heart surgery at Scripps Memorial Hospital in La Jolla, California. Dad's aortic valve was on its way out. He had no choice. He had to have this surgery. So as they wheeled him into the OR, I echoed my son's words, "Have a nice surgery." The surgery went well. The new aortic valve was working perfectly. It was humming along, doing its thing. But the complications from surgery were not so nice. For some reason, both sides of Dad's heart were not in sync. So the left side of the heart was squeezing too strongly. The right side was very weak. One minute his blood pressure was through the roof. The next minute it was dangerously low. Fluid was backing up and leaking out everywhere. His entire body was swollen. He looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. And this is the biggie. They couldn't close his chest. So when open heart surgery is done, the surgeon knits the chest bones back together with wires and then pulls the skin over it to close the chest. When they tried to do that with Dad, it put too much pressure on his lungs and he started crashing. My father was on the operating room table for almost 48 hours, too unstable to move. This is not a good place to be for that long a period of time. All kinds of things can go wrong. Skin breakdown, infection, the kidneys or the lungs fail. And there's always the possibility of blood clots or a stroke. But none of that happened. So Dad's surgeon decided to leave the chest open a little half-inch gap. You couldn't see anything. It was covered by a sterile bandage. It was not grotesque. How do I know this? Because while Dad was still in the OR in a medically induced coma, to our surprise, a nurse came out and asked us if we wanted to go in and see him. I thought that this was incredibly bold. and very kind. So we put on sterile surgical gowns. We went in. We got close enough. We weren't allowed to touch him in any way. You know, he was about 2 bed lengths away from us. We got close enough to see that he was peaceful and in no pain. 2 days later, Dad was finally moved into CCU. And he stayed in that coma on a breathing tube with that little half-inch gap for almost 2 months, while 80 phenomenal people in CCU at Scripps, doctors, nurses, therapists, lab techs, receptionists, caseworkers, worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to keep him alive. They let us bring in family pictures. We hung them around his room. They even let us bring in Dad's iPod. And I will forever have etched in my memory the sounds of Dad's favorite composers, Beethoven, Mahler, Rachmaninoff, enveloping him, punctuated by the low beeping sounds of all those machines he was hooked up to. Periodically, our son would ask to see his grandpa. My husband and I had told him that Grandpa was in a deep sleep. Well, about 6 weeks into it, that sweet little 9-year-old boy put his hands on his hips. He looked up at me and he said, "Mom, my grandpa needs to see me." And in yet another bold act of kindness, Scripps let us wrap up our son in a sterile gown. And I will forever have etched in my memory the image of that precious boy holding his grandpa's hand. So slowly, Dad began to recover. Both sides of the heart started to squeeze and sink, thanks to the heroic efforts of his cardiologist, who stayed up many nights trying to figure out the magic combination of drugs to help the left side of Dad's heart squeeze less vigorously while nudging the right side of his heart to strengthen. But what to do with that little half-inch gap? Well, they took Dad's right pectoral muscle and his left rectus muscle near the rib cage, and they pulled those 2 muscles up into place, fashioning a flap to cover the heart and fill in that gap between the bones. They never knitted the bones back together. And then we all held our breath as Dad's surgeon closed the skin over the chest. It is my understanding this kind of surgery, it is very rare. It is the Hail Mary pass of heart surgery. It is what you do when there is nothing left to do. My father was operated on December 4th, 2008. Once they brought him out of the medically induced coma in late January, he took his sweet time to awaken. About a week. And only then did we confirm no brain damage. In February of 2009, Dad was transferred to Scripps Encinitas to that hospital's inpatient rehabilitation wing. When you were laid out for so long, the body loses 2% of its muscle mass every day, so you do the math. When Dad entered rehab at Scripps, he was like a 2-month-old baby. He had to learn how to do everything again. He had to learn how to sit and roll from side to side and move his neck and retrain the muscles. He had to relearn how to sit and stand, grasp and swallow. Dad was on a feeding tube for 4.5 months, and when he finally passed his swallowing test, the voice and swallowing coach said to him, "So, Bob, what would you like to eat?" His reply, "Costco hot dog." And you know what? Nobody asked her to, but she went to Costco and she got it for him. We celebrated Dad's 80th birthday at Scripps Encinitas. They let us throw a party in their outdoor healing garden. They even let Dad have a little chocolate mousse. On July 3rd, 2009, 1 day shy of 7 months, we celebrated Dad's independence. We finally took him home. This was an incredibly challenging case, and Scripps did everything right. Now, in the beginning, I thought a little cynically that Dad was getting all of this exceptional care because I was on television. I came to realize after walking the halls of Scripps at all hours of the day and night, everybody who enters those doors gets treated the same way, with a smile and a hug, a sense of grace and dignity and humanity, a profound sensitivity to the patient and their family, because that is the Scripps way. My dad lived another 7 years before Parkinson's disease took his life in 2015. He had 7 more years to hold Mom's hand and watch his grandson grow up. The CCU staff calls my dad their miracle man, but it is the folks at Scripps who are the miracle workers. I was so impressed with them. I was so taken with the culture at Scripps, which is a striking contrast to the culture of a TV newsroom. Newsrooms are places where people are screaming and shouting. You've got 5 deadlines a day. There's breaking news. Get on the set. Get all the crews to the scene. Get all the information in your head in about a minute. It's exciting. It's exhilarating. It's an adrenaline rush. Oh yes, and it's all about the hair. You think I'm kidding. When I was anchoring the news in Miami, I was told to grow my hair out long, just below the shoulder, and wear it kind of big and poofy. Why? Well, there was a big Cuban-American population in Miami, folks who had fled the dictatorship of Fidel Castro, and the Cuban-American TV viewers liked women with big puffy hair. So you want to appeal to the audience that is watching you. When I moved to Los Angeles to anchor the news there, I was told to cut my hair above the shoulder and make it less curly, because that's what appeals to West Coast viewers. A straighter, more streamlined look. And I was told to make it blonder, because us California gals are known for being blonde. And then when I moved to San Diego to anchor the evening newscast, I was told to keep the blonde hair, but cut it even shorter, because the San Diego audience liked a sporty look. TV news networks hire consultants to help with the TV station's image. So us news anchors are basically a dog on a leash. We do what we're told by the consultants. I get it, it comes with the territory. Take the female news anchors today, at least at the local level. The blazers are now all gone. They're all wearing long, straight hair halfway down their waist that's wrapped in big curls, and they're wearing very tight-fitting V-neck, sleeveless shirts or dresses. Right? You're all shaking your head, yes. I remember a poignant moment when I was meeting with the chief legal officer at Scripps after I'd been working there for a couple of months. The meeting was running a little late, and I had to go MC an event. I told the attorney to keep talking, but I had to fix my hair and makeup. And he looked at me puzzled, and he said, "Aren't people coming to hear what you have to say?" And I said, "Well, sure, but you have to present in a certain way. There's a certain image that you have to have," as I kept reapplying my makeup and doing my hair. And he looked at me again, and he reiterated, "Aren't they coming to hear what you have to say?" And in that moment, my past life collided with my present life. And I thought, wow, can I just give you a hug and say thank you for that? The what is way more important. I also remember a time at Scripps, not long after I started, I told my boss, okay, here's when I want to take vacation during the year. I had it all mapped out, all the dates. I said I would not take vacation during fall, during open enrollment. And she looked at me puzzled and said, "Why are you doing this?" And I explained to her that during my days in TV, I was not allowed to take any vacation during the months of February, May, July, and November, because that's when the ratings were. And also when I arrived at the station, I had to be camera ready in case there was any breaking news. So if I had to leave for some reason, let's say I had to go to a doctor's appointment, or I wanted to get a bite to eat, I needed to let the producer know that I was leaving the building so that if there was any breaking news, they could get a hold of me immediately to get back to the station or have someone on standby to take my place. I really was like a dog on a leash. And my boss at Scripps smiled and she said, "Susan, take vacation whenever you want. Just let me know when you're not going to be here. I trust you to make the appropriate decisions about leaving during the day if you have a doctor's appointment or you need to grab a bite to eat." And in that moment, I took off the mental leash and felt a sense of freedom that I had not felt in my 30-plus years in television. The culture at Scripps is incredibly kind, respectful, and elegant. Healthcare workers are givers. I think it's in their DNA. And at Scripps, patients come first. And that is in large part because of our CEO, Chris Van Gorder. Chris started off as a cop, but early on in his career, he actually responded to a domestic violence call, and he was pinned in his patrol car by a female suspect who had rammed into him with her car as she tried to flee the scene. He suffered severe injuries, and he spent almost a year, like my father, recuperating in the hospital as a patient. So that moment in time changed Chris's life. Talk about navigating career change. Chris left the police force. He went back to college. He got his master's in hospital administration. That accident set the course for his second career and his mantra at Scripps to always put the patient first. So when you're looking to make a career change, sometimes the change is forced upon you like it was with Chris. Sometimes it comes from within you. To the extent that you can make sure your moves are strategic, make sure they are. Make sure you always have a plan B. What would happen if everything changed tomorrow? What would you want to do? What would you want to pursue? Make sure you have a clear vision of that and take steps to carry out that vision. I suggest that you set aside time every month to do your networking. Go to conventions, industry events, regional events, the Chamber of Commerce events that attract companies you would be interested in working with. Go to fundraisers. They attract the movers and the shakers, the CEOs, the EVPs. Meet them. Let them know who you are. That's actually how I met Chris Van Gorder. It's the same 1,000 people who show up at all the fundraising events in San Diego. And I had told Chris about the exceptional care that my father had gotten at Scripps because I was there walking the halls at all hours of the day and night. For the 2 months that my dad was in a coma, I would go be with him in the morning. Then I would rush to NBC and anchor the 4, 4:30, 5, and 6 o'clock shows. Then I would rush home to see my husband and our son for dinner. Then I would rush back to check on Dad. And then I would rush back to the station and anchor the 11 o'clock news. And then I would go back to the hospital at midnight to check on Dad. And at one point, Chris Van Gorder, who knew that I was at Scripps at all hours of the day and night, Chris said, if you ever get tired of this TV thing, you always have a home at Scripps. I laughed and said, yeah, right, whatever. Well, 4 years later, I called Chris and I said, several years ago, you said if I ever got tired of TV, I would always have a home at Scripps. If that was a throwaway line, no harm, no foul. But if it wasn't, let's talk. He said, it wasn't. Let's talk. It's important to become an expert in your field and make sure you can articulate how you can bring value to a company, not what can the company do for you, but what you can do for the company. And do your research. Look at the culture of a company. Talk to employees, industry experts. Don't just be mesmerized by the office space or the perks or the stock options. Look at the culture. Make sure that it is a fit. Decide what is important to you, because different things have different levels of importance at different times in your life. When I was in my 20s and 30s, I had this nutty idea that by the time I was 40, my goal was to have a house overlooking the ocean. What kind of a goal is that? Well, that was important to me. Why? Because I thought naively, mind you, that setting would bring me peace of mind. And peace of mind was important to me given that I was in a profession which thrived on chaos. I was in a profession where you are exposed to a lot of violence. I was a field reporter for years before I became an anchor. I have had my share of very violent stories, murders, kidnappings, rapes, death, and destruction. Well, I worked real hard, and I got real lucky. And by the time I was 40, I had that little house overlooking the ocean. And I came home to that empty house every night at midnight after I was done anchoring the 11 o'clock news. It was not a home. And while it was beautiful and peaceful, there was no peace of mind there because what I felt there was lonely. Things are not that important, but it is hard to tell that to somebody as they are on their way up the corporate ladder. It is the people in your life who matter, and it's how you treat those people on your way up and your way down that corporate ladder. It is your sense of humanity that is important. Whatever appeals to you, it is critical to make sure that you are in line with the culture that defines your place of employment, not just the nuts and bolts of that place of employment, or you will not be happy. I will admit, I was a little mesmerized by the glamour and glitz of television, but I wasn't drawn to it because of that. I wanted to get into TV because I had a curiosity about the world. I wanted to tell stories about people. I wanted to be a frontline witness to history. And I've had the good fortune to be on the front lines of history. It started right out of college. I had always wanted to work for the Olympics. And right out of college, I ended up in Edmonton, Alberta, where they were hosting the Commonwealth Games. It is like the Olympics, but for the 54 nations of the British Commonwealth. Having just gotten a degree in broadcasting and film, and having interned at 2 TV stations in Boston, I thought at the tender age of 21 that I knew everything. So I walked into the offices of the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which was producing the opening and closing ceremonies. 2.5-hour live broadcasts. Those shows broadcast to 54 countries. And I walked out 2 hours later as the liaison between the CBC and the 5,000 volunteers putting on the games in Edmonton. I was in charge of the stadium events. I was the one who cued the jets to fly over. I was the one who cued the thousands of balloons to be released into the sky. I programmed everything on the scoreboard in both English and French to satisfy the French-speaking part of Canada, the Quebecois. And I spent most of the summer dealing with British protocol because the guests of honor at the Commonwealth Games were Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, who entered the stadium in a special convertible, and they were driven around the stadium to the royal box where they would sit and watch the show. So everything had to be approved by Buckingham Palace. So the opening ceremony goes off without a hitch. And then when it comes time for the closing ceremony, about an hour before the show was set to begin, I got a phone call from a man named Peter. He had the most beautiful British accent. Anyhow, he was in charge of Prince Philip. Queen Elizabeth would not be at the closing ceremonies, so Prince Philip was the VIP. And for the closing ceremonies, he would not come in through the stadium in a car, but instead he would walk through the stands and come and sit in the royal box. This had all been approved by Buckingham Palace earlier in the summer, and all the different TV networks throughout the 54 nations of the British Commonwealth were aware that the prince would enter through the stands. Well, Peter gets on the phone to say that the plans had changed, that the prince would in fact arrive by car like he did for the opening ceremonies. I explained to him that we were too close to airtime to make a major change like that all the cameras from all the different nations would be focused on the stands because that's where the prince was going to walk in. That's what had been agreed to and approved by Buckingham Palace. I suggested to Peter that he communicate this to Prince Philip, who seemed to be a reasonable guy, who would understand, but Peter was adamant. I said, "Where's the prince now?" He said he's having lunch at the McDonald Hotel. I paused. I took a deep breath. And I said, "Peter, I will give you 10 minutes to go explain to the prince that this is the plan that had been approved by Buckingham Palace." I told Peter that if he would not go talk to the prince, I would get in a helicopter and I would land on the grounds of the McDonald Hotel myself, and I would go in and talk to the prince. And then I politely hung up the phone. Now let me set the scene. I was in the control booth with the Canadian broadcasting team. Everybody was chain smoking cigarettes. And as I hung up from Peter, the room was very quiet. I explained to everyone that we couldn't have the star of the show, Prince Philip, in the wrong place. We could not logistically let everybody know that the prince was going to be arriving over there when all the TV cameras were pointed over there. So about 7 very tense minutes later, the phone rang. It was Peter. Everyone was still chain smoking cigarettes. It is very quiet up there in the broadcast booth at the stadium. And he said, "Susan, it's Peter. The prince will arrive and walk in through the stands. He will not arrive in a car through the gate. I hope you're happy." I calmly told him to thank the prince for being so reasonable and understanding. We hung up the phone. I turned to everyone and I said, "Okay, back to plan A." And simultaneously, everybody, chain smoking, put out their cigarettes. They all got up and manned their stations. And we proceeded with the closing ceremonies, a 2-hour live show broadcast to 54 nations of the British Commonwealth. What was I thinking? Who did I think I was at the tender age of 21? But I was energized by the moment, and I was confident that we needed to stick to the plan that weeks earlier had been approved by Buckingham Palace. I've always been energized by live television. I was anchoring the news in Miami in 1987 when Pope John Paul II came to visit. There were hundreds of thousands of people in Tamiami Park who had come to listen to the Pope. The security was massive and incredibly tight. And while we were on the air, and it was nonstop coverage for hours, the producer says in our ear, "There's a small plane which has entered restricted airspace a few miles south of the park, and it's heading north to where everyone had gathered. Is this a pilot who has drifted, who has lost his way? Or is this perhaps a suicide bomber? Do we say something? If it's a false alarm, we could spark a panic. Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people fleeing the scene. I have always believed in being right, not first. So we waited, and we relied on the military and law enforcement to do their job. The military scrambled jets. They got the pilot to fly away out of that restricted airspace. We trusted our sources. We decided to be right, not first, and probably save some lives in the process. But it was scary, and it seemed to go on forever until we learned that the plane was not a threat. Credibility is king in any business, not just the news business. When you lose your credibility, that's it. It is hard to come back from that. My credibility helped pave the way for me to get ahead, to cover the big stories. I was in Miami for the downfall of Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega. I was in Israel for the beginnings of the Palestinian uprising. I remember our driver was taking us all over the place. We wanted to go to the Golan Heights, which had been captured from Syria during the Six-Day War back in 1967. And we get there, and there is nobody around. And I said to our driver, "Come on, let's go on into Syria. Let's cross the border into Lebanon." And our driver, who had been a member of the Mossad, the elite Israeli intelligence, a special operations agency, our driver said, "No, Susan, this is as far as we go." I said, "Why? There's nobody here." And he said, "There's no one here that you can see. There's a lot of people here that you can't see." I was assigned to O.J. Simpson's family for his second trial in LA. You remember, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. I was in the hallway with the Simpson family just before the verdict was read. I've had my share of the big stories, but when my 11-year-old son looked at me 9 years ago and said, "Mom, I miss you. I don't like your work until midnight," I thought I have only a small window of time left to be with him before he no longer thinks I'm cool. Perhaps it's time I seize that opportunity, or I'm going to have some serious regrets down the road. And judging by his recent behavior, that window's just about closed because nobody rolls their eyes like a 20-year-old boy, except perhaps a 20-year-old girl. Now, I think change is good. It's invigorating, but it can also be scary. But then what could be scarier than television news? During the course of my career in TV, I have been shot at. I've been in a hostage crisis. I've been in 3 riots, one in Israel, the second in Miami, the third in Los Angeles. The one in Miami was particularly wild. It was September of 1991. I was in a portion of Miami just north of downtown called Little Haiti when the first democratically elected president of Haiti, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, was ousted in a military coup. There was a big Haitian population in Miami, folks who had fled the regime of dictator Papadoc Duvalier. And when Jean-Bertrand Aristide was arrested and removed from office, thousands of people took to the streets in Miami's Little Haiti. We raced to cover the event, but things got crazy when counter-protesters started imitating the practice of Haiti's Tonton Macoutes, a paramilitary force that was known for throwing gasoline-laced tires over people's heads and then setting them on fire. There were several thousand people protesting on the streets of Little Haiti, and at one point it got too violent, and the tires were being set on fire and thrown to the crowd. My photographer said to me, "It's time to get out of here." He told me, "Get on the floor of the van, lay down, do not raise your head for any reason," and he would drive us out. And it was frightening as we slowly made our way through the screaming, fiery crowd who tried to actually shake and overturn our van. I have literally driven through a wall of flames during raging wildfires across San Diego. I've escaped from hurricanes, Hurricane Andrew in Miami, and earthquakes. I was in Los Angeles in 1994 when the Northridge earthquake hit. At the time, I was anchoring the morning news in LA, so I was up at 4 a.m. every day getting ready for work. And I remember that exact moment at 4:31 a.m. on January 17th, when that 6.7 magnitude earthquake struck. I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth. I remember first the sound, incredibly loud rolling thunder, and then the shaking, the tremendous vibration. It felt as though a freight train was coming into my home right through my belly. I was living alone up a long and windy road in Laurel Canyon. And when the shaking stopped, I thought, I have to get out of this house immediately. I have to get out of this remote canyon, or I may not get out at all. I need to get down to Sunset Boulevard and get to work. And I went to work, and we were on the air nonstop for days reporting on the devastation from that awful event. I got into the TV business and now the healthcare business because I am a storyteller. I have a passion for communications, and you should always follow your passion. You spend too much time at work to be doing something you're not passionate about. I've always been attracted to quality, innovation, and change. Think about it. Television changes every 30 seconds. But I get the sense that change is happening everywhere because of this, right? Now, this can be addictive, and I've spent more than my fair share of time on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, but I would advise you, do not get caught up in the useless chatter of social media. Surround yourself with people who are smarter than you, who are honest with you, who will say yes and no to you and tell you why. Make sure you have mentors and keep those mentors close, people whose ideas you respect, people you can bounce ideas off of. One of my mentors is Howard Putnam, the former CEO of Southwest Airlines. I met Howard when I was anchoring the news in Dallas back in 1981. At that time, he had been hired to try and save another struggling airline, Braniff. He actually had to take Braniff into bankruptcy in order to save it. It was a very stressful time for Howard, yet he was always available to the media. He was upfront and transparent. He was that way with us. He was that way with his employees. Transparency is one of the keys to maintaining your workforce. The news may not always be good, but having open lines of communication and transparency with your employees translates into a happier and more loyal workforce. So Howard gave a speech 10 years ago in San Diego, and I met him for breakfast. He was the one who said, how much longer are you going to keep doing this TV thing? Keep working until midnight, anchoring the news. And I had never considered doing anything else because TV was all I had ever known. You get these blinders on. You think, okay, I have this very limited set of marketable skills. Howard was the one who gave me permission to take the risk, to step outside my comfort zone, to see how my skills translated into another industry, to look at what else is out there in this great, big, vast, wild, wonderful world. Now, as I said, change is good, but change is scary, and many times failure can be a part of change. But don't be afraid of failure. Life would be pretty boring if everything went well all the time. Let me tell you about failure. When I was working at CBS back in the 1980s, there was a hostage drama being played out in San Diego. There was a guy who was stealing cars and kidnapping people for several days. During the 5 p.m. news, police had surrounded a home. They thought that they had found the suspect. I was in the newsroom. The phone rang. We all had phones in our desks. And whomever was free, you were expected to pick up the phone. So I answered the phone. Hi, this is the newsroom. How can I help you? The guy on the phone says, I'm watching your newscast. They've surrounded this house looking for that suspect. Well, I'm the guy, and I'm not in the house. Now, we get a lot of crazy phone calls in the newsroom. But at that moment, I looked up at the TV monitors to see that our reporter on the scene confirmed, in fact, that the suspect was not in the house. I frantically scribbled something on a piece of paper to give to the news director, explaining who I had on the phone. This began a 5-hour negotiating session. I asked the guy what he wanted. He wanted me to go on TV and say that we would give money to help his pregnant girlfriend with her medical expenses. We were never going to do that. But I said we couldn't do that until I was able to confirm that he was, in fact, the suspect. I needed the name and the contact number for his girlfriend. He said that he had gambled away thousands of dollars in Vegas. Police came to the newsroom, but the suspect refused to speak with them. He would only speak with me. And so the police negotiators passed notes back and forth, instructing me what to say to him. We tracked down his girlfriend. She was pregnant, but not with his child. At one point, I asked him to put the hostage on the phone. And to my surprise, he did. I asked her her name, and then a series of yes and no questions. Is this where you live? Is it a house? Is it an apartment? Is this in East San Diego? Is this South San Diego? We were able to locate the apartment. And then the suspect gets nervous. He pulls the phone away from her. He gets back on the phone, and as we continue our negotiations, that female hostage jumps out of the second-story window. She is rescued with minor injuries. Now the suspect gets really nervous. He says he has no more bargaining power. He says if the police come in, he's got a gun, and he will not be coming out alive. After several hours, police were able to isolate the area, cut off the power to the apartment. They had me hand off the negotiations to them around 10:30 in the evening. It was a very long, exhausting night. And something major had changed. For the first time in my professional life, I was no longer covering the story. I was now part of the story. The news director says, go home, come back early. You need to get ready to put together a story on what happened for every newscast tomorrow. So I go home. I have a really big glass of wine. I get up the next morning. I turn on the radio at 6:30 in the morning, and the first thing I hear is my name. The second thing I hear is that police had stormed the apartment around 5:30 a.m. and found that the suspect had in fact killed himself. I come to work. The news director says all the TV stations and the newspapers want to talk with me, as I was the last person to talk to this man alive. So we call a press conference. And here's where we talk about blind ambition. The first question came from a reporter at a competing TV station. She blurted out, so, do you feel like a failure? The other reporter, we were friendly competitors, at least that's what I thought. Was she upset that the man had called our station instead of hers? Maybe. Was she upset that I had answered the phone instead of her? Maybe. Here's where we talk about blind ambition. The first question came from a reporter at a competing TV station. She blurted out, so, do you feel like a failure? This other reporter, we were friendly competitors, at least that's what I thought. Was she upset that the man had called our station instead of hers? Maybe. Was she upset that I had answered the phone instead of her? Maybe. Had I failed? No. But the issue of failure was front and center. I said no, I did not feel like a failure. After all, we were able to save the life of the hostage. And if someone who has mental issues also has a gun and wants to take their own life, in the end, there isn't a whole lot you can do to prevent that. But it was the tone of her question that actually changed the way I worked. I thought to myself, don't let blind ambition cloud your dignity, your sense of humanity, when asking the hard questions during an interview. Because when we interview people, it is usually because they have been through something unusual, something traumatic. That's what makes news. And I had now been through something traumatic. I think you can translate this concept to your place of business as well. Put yourself in the place of your employees, your clients. And remember that failure often gives you those aha moments in your life, those moments of true illumination and perfection. Now, if you really want to fail, seek out a perfect life, because no one is perfect all the time. Instead, seek out those moments of perfection and embrace failure. Don't be embarrassed by it. Failure usually breeds creativity, and creativity breeds innovation. And given the pace of technological change these days, you need constant innovation just to keep up with the pace of change. And also keep in mind that persistence is stronger than failure. Those are the words of the late, great college basketball coach John Wooden, who won 10 NCAA championships in 12 years when he was at the helm of UCLA. He was and is still considered one of the best college coaches anywhere. In his book entitled Wooden, Coach says, "Few people have suffered more personal, professional, and political adversity than this man. He persisted in the face of failure, and he emerged victorious." Look at all the things that happened to this man. Who is this man? President Abraham Lincoln. And as you're making a change, let the words of my father echo in your ears. Always leave them laughing, he would say. Make your entrances humble and your exits graceful. Folks generally don't remember all the stuff in between, but they remember your beginnings and your endings. And don't burn any bridges. Don't have a scorched earth policy, because the person you were not nice to, I can guarantee you, you will run into that person again. Maybe years down the line, maybe at a different company, maybe at a board meeting or a fundraiser. And this time, the position of power might be reversed, and you might actually need that person. My dad, who was a pretty astute businessman, always taught me to treat everyone as an equal member of the team. Treat them with dignity, grace, and here's that word again, humanity. You've heard the saying, kill them with kindness. You get a lot farther, a lot faster with a smile and the words please, thank you, and yes. The answer is yes. Now what's the question? Yes, we can help you find a doctor. Yes, we can have that PowerPoint ready for you by tomorrow. Yes, we can arrange to have your clients Skype in on the conversation. It is much easier to say no. It is a lot harder to say yes, because that usually means you have to work harder. But work that's easy eventually makes you complacent. And complacency leads to boredom. And who wants a life of that? I remember emceeing an event and a woman came up to me and she said, "Do you remember me?" She said, "We spent a lot of time together in the CCU waiting room when your dad was in the hospital." I thought for a minute, got real quiet, and nodded. Her son had been in a coma with a traumatic brain injury. I looked at her. Dare I ask? She smiled and said, "On Christmas Day, my son opened his eyes." I started to cry then, as I do now. "Dare I ask," I said, "how is he now 3 years later?" She smiled and said, "He's married, and in 3 weeks, I'm going to be a grandma." At Scripps, we treat more than 700,000 people a year, and we have a story for each and every one of them. Most not quite so dramatic, but each of them just as important. I feel fortunate to be part of the solution. I'm invigorated to go to work every day, to be surrounded by brilliant people, by new mentors who value quality, innovation, humanity, and the culture of yes, who put the patient front and center of everything we do. There is a culture of compassion here. There is something about Scripps. We have spectacular doctors and nurses, and a culture that treats patients and employees like family, not just the patients whose daughter happened to be on television. And that's a pretty exquisite environment in which to work. It's the environment that works for me. You need to find the environment that works for you. Maybe you don't like living in the city. Maybe you'd rather be a forest ranger or a safari guide in the Serengeti. Maybe you're the person who's going to figure out how to teleport all of us around the globe. Or maybe you're going to come up with the next big idea that nobody has even thought of yet. So give yourself permission to just sit and think without any distractions, without your cell phone. Let your mind wander, and then write down what's important to you. When I was younger, the job, and only the job, mattered to me. I put way too much emphasis on acquiring things. I put way too much emphasis on ambition. Now from this vantage point, the job has to be in sync with my family. And what matters most is not the size of my house or where it's located. It is the love of the people in that house. It is what makes that house a home. It's how can I make somebody else's life better? How can I bring a smile and a sense of humanity to somebody else's life? I've always been drawn to that. In fact, back in the 1980s, when I was anchoring the news in Miami, I was at the NBC channel, and it was Channel 4, and we did a series called 4 Wishes. Several times a year, we would grant wishes to our viewers. One woman from Fort Lauderdale wrote us and said that she had a pen pal in Bristol, England. They had written to each other since they were in kindergarten. They had chronicled their lives on paper: war, marriage, divorce, illness, death. But they had never actually met. They had never even spoken on the phone. And the woman in England, Dulcie Pether, who never had kids, was now old and quite ill. And the woman in Florida thought they would never meet. So we came up with this plan for a trip, for a long weekend. We took the woman from Florida on board the British Airways Concorde jet. We took her to Bristol, England, to meet her lifelong friend. And I will always remember that moment when she rang the doorbell of that modest flat, and we waited for Dulcie to open the door. I could see the decades of memories just flooding her face. And our camera was rolling when Dulcie, who could barely walk, finally opened the door as those two women burst into tears and gave each other this lifelong embrace. I thought, wow, here's the power of television, can make a positive impact on somebody's life. That to me is more intoxicating than death and destruction covering a car chase or a brush fire. First Lady Barbara Bush, who I hope is now dancing up in the clouds, once said, "You will never regret not having done one more deal. You will always regret not having spent more time with your friends and family." I will forever remember the day I sat our son down after I had resigned from NBC and told him, "Mom's not going to work until midnight anymore." You know what that 12-year-old boy did? He gave me the biggest hug he's ever given me, and when he pulled back, there was a tear, a big fat tear rolling down his cheek. And that moment was worth more than any major story I had covered in my 30-plus years in television. And there were many major stories and interviews. I had the honor to interview 2 Nobel Peace Prize winners, South African Bishop Desmond Tutu and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel. I remember how soft Elie Wiesel's voice was, and you leaned in and you hung on every word. I had the honor of interviewing poet laureate Maya Angelou, who wrote, "I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings." I remember her saying, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." And when that big fat tear rolled down my son's cheek, that 12-year-old boy, when he heard that I would now be home in the evening to spend more time with him without having to rush back after a hurried dinner to anchor the 11 p.m. news, he made me feel like the mom I had always wanted to be. So I've gone from TV to healthcare. I could not have imagined this path. The career change presented itself because of my father's surgery, circumstances beyond my control. But at the core of it, I am still a storyteller. Find out what is at your core, what is your sweet spot that you can transfer from company to company, from industry to industry. Navigating career change, it's scary, it's invigorating, and it can be so very rewarding if you leave yourself open to the possibility, if you don't compromise your credibility, if you maintain a culture of transparency and dignity and humanity. My family owes Scripps a debt of gratitude that I will hopefully spend the rest of my working life trying to repay. And journalists, you know, we're a little bit like doctors. I think we're both science-based. We want the facts. I believe the facts are important. I suspect you do too. And the last time I checked, pigs still don't fly. Thank you.